Good morning. Is this working well enough? Yeah. Thanks, Marissa. So I'm the interim director of the John Nicholas Brown Center for Public Humanities and Cultural Heritage. And I have the great pleasure of welcoming you to Guantanamo Going Forward, What's Next for Current and Former Detainees. We have an exceptionally interesting, knowledgeable, distinguished, and distinctive group of speakers today whose talks will themselves be very thought-provoking, but whose talks will also provide, I'm sure, the basis for a stimulating discussion later this morning, for which I hope you can all join us. And I'm very much looking forward to that discussion as well. Before I turn this over to my colleague, Associate Professor of Comparative Literature and Hispanic Studies, Esther Whitfield, who organized this conference, let me just say that I am so pleased that the center was able to help make this event rather happen. For me, Guantanamo Going Forward represents the kind of engaged, active, committed, and collaborative work and ways of thinking that the center aspires to promote and produce. Work that explicitly and implicitly asks fundamental questions about our shared humanity as we try in oftentimes in innovative, experimental, and or sometimes just improvisational ways to make the world a better place. So let me just conclude by saying first that I feel so lucky to have the job that I have that puts me here today. Second, that I'm very excited to welcome you to this conference. And third, to just pass this along to Professor Whitfield, and who I'd like to thank for imagining this event into existence. So, Esther, come on up.
So good morning. I would also like to extend a warm welcome to everybody to this half-day symposium, which we've called Guantanamo Going Forward, What's Next for Current and Former Detainees. I don't know if I did that, sorry. So I want to explain the title of the symposium a little bit and acknowledge in it a continuation of the strange temporalities that have governed this 45 square mile piece of land at the eastern edge of Cuba, Guantanamo, from its lease in perpetuity that has kept it under US control since 1903, to the indefinite quality of detentions there under the rubric of the War on Terror. We began planning this conference a little over a year ago in October 2016, and the title was going to be simply After Guantanamo. Its main line of questioning was going to be, and still will be, but I'll say more about this, the lives, livelihoods, and futures of those men for whom release from Guantanamo had long been the end goal of tireless advocates, but whose freedom could not but bear the scars and legacies of up to 14 years of confinement, deprivation, interrogation, and in many cases, physical and psychological torture. After Guantanamo, as a title and as an idea, was prompted by reports of difficult resettlement of detainees in third countries that were not their homes, of requests and hope for economic reparation, of recidivism that was also reported, and of psychiatric and physical torture among former detainees, as well as reports of mental health concerns among the US military guards who watched over them. So I think these are all the kinds of ideas that we're making us really want to think about, well, what happens after Guantanamo? So After Guantanamo as a title was inspired by the work of people like Debi Cornwall, whose exhibit, Welcome to Camp America Beyond Gitmo, is on display at the Public Humanities Center. I hope many of you will see it, by Wells Dixon and his colleagues at the Center for Constitutional Rights, who've represented many current and former detainees as they try to navigate their way in the world after Guantanamo. And of course, Mohamedou Ould Slahi, who will be here later today, released from Guantanamo just under a year ago, but in his diary and statements after release, a model really of forgiveness. I don't know if you've seen a video that Mohamedou Ould Slahi released just after he was, well, published just after he was released, in which he talks about forgiveness as his main asset. So after Guantanamo was envisaged, quite hopefully, we soon realized, although its main focus would have been how Guantanamo remains with detainees after their release, I think those of us who were planning it harbored some hopes that the detention centers and even the base itself might by now be in a more conciliatory moment of their history. That President Obama might have found a way to win his race against time and close the detention centers, even if that meant relocating their occupants to what Carol Rosenberg of the Miami Herald, who really is the longest established, most fearless of reporters on the base, refers to as Guantanamo North. Maximum security prisons within the US. Or failing this, that the next president would be working to bring the worst of this chapter to a close. After the re-establishing of diplomatic relations between the US and Cuba in 2015, with base negotiations as one of President Raul Castro's preconditions for further rapprochement, there was even a very admittedly faint possibility that the base may have been in the process of being returned to Cuba. So I'm working with many verb tenses here because it's a very complex moment to be thinking about these things. Today, though, 41 men remain at Guantanamo. During his campaign, President Trump said he would load up its prisons with bad dudes. His government is reportedly attempting to reopen legal channels permitting the detention there of more people. The base's physical infrastructure is also reportedly being reinforced with a new fiber optic system, hospital facilities, school building for the many children who grow up in this, or go to school in this very odd space as members of military families. So really, as part of this Guantanamo going forward conversation, rather than merely after Guantanamo, we also need to ask urgently, what does the future hold for those detainees who are still there? 5 of these have been cleared for release, but the administration is not taking any action to release them. Here's my notes. 3 have been convicted, 7 await prosecution, and 26 are forever prisoners, in inverted commas, held without charge or trial. With the oldest detainee at Guantanamo approaching his 70th birthday, will some or all remain there for the rest of their lives? And at the same time, and this will also, I hope, be part of our conversation, those who have been released continue to face enormous legal, economic, social, emotional, psychological challenges. How are they to rebuild their lives? The Canadian government's well-publicized this decision this summer to award compensation to former child detainee Omar Khadr is one way forward, but it's not the full picture, and nor is it the norm. So I think one of the questions I hope we'll think about is, how can a man once detained at Guantanamo reclaim lost years, lost opportunities, lost communities, and lost trust? And what can we do as students and as scholars, as individuals and institutions in the humanities and across disciplines to keep their lives in the foreground, to advocate for change? These are questions that I hope we'll all hear and think about this morning and also going forward. So today's symposium has been planned and hosted by the John Nicholas Brown Center for Public Humanities and Cultural Heritage, whose directors, first Susan Smulian, who is now on leave, and now Jim Egan. Staff and students have been enthusiastic collaborators all along. I want to thank in particular Marissa Brown, who's sitting at the back here, Assistant Director of Programs at the Center, whose ideas, energy, and capacity for seeing both the big picture and the small details have made some very complicated logistics seem easy. This includes getting Mohamedou Ould Slahi by video conference from Mauritania today. So thanks to Marissa for overseeing that. The Brown Arts Initiative awarded the Fit Artist in Residency grant to Debi Cornwall, allowing her to exhibit her wonderful Welcome to Camp America at the Center for Public Humanities and to meet with students and faculty at Brown during this week. Today's event is co-sponsored by departments and centers with various interests, attesting, I think, to the really broad relevance and urgency of what we know today as Guantanamo. My thanks go to the Departments of Comparative Literature and Hispanic Studies, my home departments, to the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America, and the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, all of whom have contributed in this. So with many thanks to everybody who's come early this morning on a busy shopping period day, I'm going to hand over to Maggie Unverzagt Goddard, who's going to introduce each of our speakers in turn. So thank you.
Hello, good morning. My name is Maggie Unverzagt Goddard, and I am a third-year PhD student in American Studies and a graduate of the Public Humanities program. Our first speaker is Debi Cornwall, who's a conceptual documentary artist who returned to visual expression in 2014 after a 12-year career as a civil rights lawyer. While completing her bachelor's degree in modern culture and media here at Brown, she trained in photography at RISD. After working as an AP stringer and as an investigator for the Federal Public Defender's Office, she attended Harvard Law School and practiced for more than a decade as a civil rights attorney representing innocent DNA exonerees. Informed by that experience, Welcome to Camp America inside Guantanamo Bay offers a vivid and disorienting perspective on Guantanamo Bay and the global diaspora of men once held there after they've been cleared and freed. The subject of one-woman exhibitions in China, Switzerland, and South Korea, Camp America is shown at the Public Humanities Center Carriage House Gallery in conjunction with the conference. Please welcome Debi Cornwall.
Thank you, Jim and Esther and Maggie. Thanks everyone for coming so early on a Friday morning. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my photographic work at Guantanamo and with its survivors off the base. I, as Maggie mentioned, went to law school and was an advocate for 12 years representing men who'd spent years in prison for crimes they did not commit. And in that capacity, I was interested in the systemic injustice, what went wrong, how could we use litigation to change the abuse of power, and what is the very personal impact of injustice on individuals, relationships, and communities. So, Guantanamo. Historically, from the perspective of North Americans, Guantanamo was a spot for R&R, for sailors on leave. So here's a postcard sent in 1955. Hi, honey, I'm having a swell time. Think you'd like it here. I went for a nice, cool swim. That's the history. On September 11th of 2001, that history was about to change for Guantanamo and for all of us. On that date, I was about to start my job as an attorney soon after finishing law school and working for a federal judge for a year. And I put off starting that job because my office was in Tribeca, 8 blocks north of the smoldering remains of the World Trade Center. So as I started this work around the country, I kept an eye on what was happening in the so-called War on Terror as bombs started dropping in Afghanistan. And on January 11th, 2002, the first 20 prisoners arrived at Guantanamo Bay to be held in pens until more complete detention centers and prison facilities would be built for what became 780 inmates, referred to by military authorities as detainees, because if they referred to them as prisoners, they would receive and be entitled to protections under the Geneva Conventions and laws of war. Guantanamo was chosen precisely to be outside of those norms, beyond the reach of United States courts and the rule of law. So my strategy, when I decided to step away from litigation and look at these same kinds of institutional questions from a new perspective, to invite new eyes to look, because after more than a decade, we'd seen this picture or some variation of it over and over and over again, didn't really draw us in anymore. For many of us as Americans, we didn't look, and we'd lost the thread that Guantanamo was really there in our names to make us feel safer, while holding hundreds of men without charge, without trial, without necessarily knowing if they would ever get to leave, much less go home. So my strategy as an artist was to find a different way in to invite people to look again. So one of the things I did was go to the gift shop in Guantanamo Bay at the US Naval Station. You'll see some objects like this toddler t-shirt, which I bought for $7.99 over at the Carriage House Gallery. I also photographed sort of the evolution of the tourist messaging at Guantanamo Bay by photographing the fun that's available for military and civilians who live on the base. So here's a kiddie pool on the windward side. And then I juxtaposed those images, some of which you'll see in that exhibition, with spaces of the prisoners. This is a compliant detainee media room in Camp 5, a solitary confinement unit that has since been closed, where if an inmate followed the rules, he might have been given the privilege to watch a censor-approved movie in this chair with one leg shackled to the floor while being surveilled through a two-way mirror. A prayer rug with an arrow to Mecca in Camp Echo. You kind of consider the space and this ledge in this small cell. It's not actually possible for a body to pray in the direction of Mecca in that space, but it's there on the media tour. The Liberty Center band room, where off-duty officers can rock out during their downtime. One of the means of breaking down the inmates for interrogation was to blast loud music in their cells, and I'm sure Mohamedou may be speaking about that. Another cell shown on the media tour in Camp 6, a communal detention center. Comfort items, so-called, in Camp 5, laid out for the press to see. The top row for the more compliant, the lower row for the less compliant. And when I ultimately was able to start meeting with men who had been cleared and released from Guantanamo, those who were interested in seeing the pictures that I made looked at this picture and said, well, but we never got the large tube of toothpaste. And they would say, oh, but we don't have shoes in your size, or ask your interrogator for a pillow. So I became very interested in the disconnect between the show and the official messaging and the reality that was happening behind closed doors that we didn't get to hear about. So I'm juxtaposing those things. The public view, the tiki bar near the officers' club, with a feeding chair in Camp 5. Prisoners held in indefinite detention had only their bodies to use to protest the conditions of their confinement and the fact of their confinement. So they were force-fed using these structures. A recreation pen in Camp Echo that I believe Mohamedou, if he's on, may also be familiar with. And that Moazam, a British Pakistani releasee living back in the UK now, who's written an essay for the book, writes about in my book, Welcome to Camp America. No protection under the Cuban sky and the heat. And you've got a few options. You can walk or run clockwise, counterclockwise. You can stay in one place, or maybe you can try to climb to the top and get a peek of the ocean and the beach below. Here's Windmill Beach, the same location as that postcard from the first image, where an officer is off duty. So this is the cover of Guantánamo Diary, Mohamedou Ould Slahi's memoir that was heavily redacted and published while he was still imprisoned. There's a detainee library, and a lot of books don't make it into the library to get passed on to the inmates there. Mohamedou's book was one of the books that did not make it into the library. So on one of my trips, I brought it close, and I photographed it open to one of its completely redacted spreads at Windmill Beach, just a mile below the institution where he was on that day still being held. So one of the many rules imposed on people making pictures at Guantanamo Bay under the military regulations is you may not photograph anyone's face. And my experience of spending time there over the course of 3 visits and learning to not photograph anyone's face and experiencing the human spaces but devoid of people was to experience what felt to me like a denial of personhood. That was strikingly to me, given my perspective as an advocate in my past professional life, extended to the military personnel who lived there. It struck me that no one has chosen to live in this place, and no matter which side of the wire you're living on, you haven't chosen to be there. Your life is defined by routine and order and boredom. Again, a denial of humanity, which is a different way of thinking about injustice that I began to play with. So I decided to reach out to men who had been released after being cleared from Guantanamo Bay, going from Cuba, and I ended up visiting 14 men in 9 countries marked here on the map around the world. I did some research, read everything I could read that they had published, memoirs, interviews, spoke to attorneys, and did some other kinds of research as well. And one thing I found was that as part of a PSYOP, psychological operations in connection with the war in Afghanistan, the United States military dropped leaflets, messaging over these lands, advertising in this form, sort of doctored monetary notes, Afghanis, and in the form of double-sided leaflets with images and text, turn in foreign fighters. Get wealth and power beyond your dreams. The US government offered bounty money, which it said millions of dollars, enough money to take care of your family, your village, your tribe for the rest of your life if you turn in that foreign person. Well, one thing that we know from our experience about human nature that's applied in the criminal law context in the United States is that if an informant is paid to turn someone in, that person has an incentive to lie. So that's just truth about us as people. But that truth was not applied in this context as it would have been if these cases were played out in the United States courts. So many of the men who ended up in Guantanamo were kidnapped and turned in for bounty money. So as I started connecting with some of the released men, I thought about different ways to represent what they had been through and what their experiences were. How do you represent the passage of time and what is lost? One way that I considered doing it for the book was ephemera documents. So this is a letter from someone's brother to an inmate, and you can see the markings cleared by the US military. It's been vetted and allowed through by the time he gets it, and upon closer inspection, I realized the date on the letter was August 21st, 2002. It wasn't cleared to get to the inmate until November 20th, 2003. A year and a half to get a letter through from your family. Just a glimpse of what you miss during those moments. I also collected, in collaboration with some of the men that I met with, family pictures. So the first man I met with is one of Wells Dixon's clients, Jamal, in Algeria, who spent almost 13 years in Guantanamo Bay. And just before I was to fly to meet him, he emailed and he said, I'm really sorry. I know we had an appointment, but I can't meet with you. I'm having a really hard time. I thought I was okay, but I don't even talk to my family if I can avoid it. So I'm sorry, but I can't do it. I ended up going, and he decided he was willing to meet with me, and he invited me to his home in the presence of his niece. This is a picture of Jamel with his sister as a child. So the sister's daughter stayed with me in the afternoon when Jamel went to afternoon prayer, and I said to his niece, how's he doing? And she said, I was just a child when he left, but my mother says he's just the same. Which again, he's not just the same. So what can we know from the outside versus what's happening inside? So I'm interested in playing with how to use visuals to get at this disconnect, to get at the interiors. So one thing I did was take some portraits. This is Jamel. And I showed a very small sample of people in suburban Boston, this picture and some others. And the reaction I got was, oh, we're so glad you chose to photograph his face. He has such kind eyes and such a lovely smile. We're so glad he's okay. And I realized that simple editorial choice of whether to portray someone who has been through a trauma, smiling or sad or somber, could lead to very different perceptions about how they're doing. And I wanted to cut that out of the equation. So here's the direction I ended up taking. I photographed each of the released men as though they were still in Guantanamo Bay, from the back, replicating the military's no faces rule in their new lives. So this is Jamel, 11 years, 11 months, and 18 days in Guantanamo with no charges. He was cleared not once, but twice, but still held for years before he was released back to Algeria, in fact, against his will, which Wells may speak of. I'm showing these in the order in which I met these men. Morad is a French Algerian who returned home to France. He is a youth Muslim counselor, Muslim youth counselor, and so we collaborated to find a location of relevance to his life. So we found the skate park in Lyon where he lives. He's now an activist and is very public. He's written a second memoir now about his experience in Guantanamo and life afterwards. Next, I went to Slovakia and I met Hussein, a Yemeni who could not return home, shipped to Slovakia where he didn't know anyone, didn't speak the language. It's the only country in Europe without a single mosque. So we photographed him at midday prayer outside. Almost 13 years in Guantanamo, charges never filed. Also photographed someone else in Slovakia, Hamza, a Tunisian who was in Guantanamo for 13 years. And 2 weeks before I arrived, Slovak special forces arrived and broke down his door and shot him with rubber bullets and carried him away. And he was taken to the hospital. And he asked why. I've done nothing wrong. I was cleared. I've been minding my own business. And they said, you didn't leave your apartment for a few days. So he kept all of this destruction for the American witness to see. And it handed me a sheaf of papers to say, I can prove I left my apartment. And he said to me, do you think the FBI will help me? I know they were in Guantanamo. There is an incredible sense of confusion among the released men. I didn't do anything wrong. I was cleared. I was released. Why am I being treated like a suspect? Why am I being followed? Why am I being surveilled? Isn't there someone who will help me? And the reality is that the American government is not going to step in. So there's this pervasive idea that America will be the beacon for human rights around the world, notwithstanding our actions over the last 16 years. So Hamza goes to the river. He is the tallest, brownest person, one of the only Muslims for hundreds of miles. He wants to be left alone, so he comes here to the river to seek solace. And we collaborated to make a picture of him here. Then I went to Albania to photograph one of Wells's former clients among 4 Chinese Uyghurs who I photographed here, among 5 Chinese Uyghurs who were transferred to Albania. They've now lived here for 10 years, and I photographed each of them collaboratively in locations to emphasize the disorientation of landing in such a foreign culture. The quote from this man who has chosen to remain anonymous is, "This is not freedom, this is Camp 8, Albania." Each of these men has received legal asylum, but they haven't received national identity cards. And in Albania, if you don't have a national ID card, you cannot legally register for a driver's license, a car, a bank account, a cell phone. You essentially can't function as a fully fledged member of society, get a job without that material. And as I show you some of the pictures of the other Chinese Uyghurs that I met, I'll tell you I put the camera down for a couple of days and tried to see if I could sort out this problem for them naively, as well. Wells will, I think, agree in spending a couple of days having meetings with former Supreme Court justices of Albania, the former president of Albania, nonprofit managers. Ultimately, the answer I got was, yes, they should have ID cards as a matter of law, but we've done so much for them already. They should be grateful. And I had a meeting with the US Embassy, which was canceled just before I arrived. Another of Wells's former clients, an Uzbek who has chosen to remain anonymous, also living in Albania, has now a graduate degree there and was offered an executive position that he could not take because it would have required international travel. So he's continuing his education, the last I heard, and trying to find ways to support his family. Moving along so we can get to the other people on the panel. Murat, a Turkish-German man, returned home to Germany. He said to me, you know, this is a really small town where I live, and I'd love to move with my family to Berlin just to have some anonymity, because Germans see me and they think that guy who was in Guantanamo, that terrorist, although I was cleared, he's an activist now and he's very public, but it's hard not to be able to just live your life as a regular person, to be marked by this experience. He says the Turks here in the town, in the city where I live, see me driving a BMW and they think I've been compensated and they want me to help them. But I'm not going to leave my parents again, and they are here, so I'm going to stay. He's a refugee counselor, and so we collaborated to find this refugee housing complex to make a picture. Mohamedou is an Egyptian Australian. We returned to his hometown outside of Alexandria in Egypt. He is one of the very few former Guantanamo inmates who's been compensated. So he has businesses in Egypt, he lives in Australia, he and his wife travel internationally, but money doesn't solve everything. Here's a tweet documenting not the first time that Mohamedou and his wife had been detained during an international crossing. They're on a list, their passport gets taken away, and they have to confront that every time that they seek to exercise their rights to travel. I should say that none of the men released from Guantanamo Bay will ever set foot on American soil or cross American airspace, which is why Mohamedou is appearing by video conference today. Sami, an Al Jazeera cameraman arrested crossing the Afghan-Pakistan border, covering the war for Al Jazeera, was released after more than 5 years. He's been given a promotion and is now heading up a Rights and Liberties division at Al Jazeera. So we made a picture behind the desk in Doha at Al Jazeera International Headquarters. From Qatar, I then moved on to the UK with Moazem, who is a tireless advocate for the rights of former prisoners, for Muslims, in the context of the war on terror. He has a wicked sense of humor. He's written an essay for the book. And one of the remarkable things about him is that he has reached out to some of his former captors. And we see, here's one of them who he hosted overnight in his home. And you see these remarkable relationships building and these remarkable conversations that shift a paradigm if we can recognize the humanity of those on both sides of the wire and what this system has wrought on our common humanity. There's a different kind of conversation that we can have, and it's quite powerful and quite moving. So in that connection, I'll show you one picture that I made that is not in the book. It's a photograph of a former guard named Terry, and I photographed him back near his home in the Arizona desert at Parade Rest. And the one of many remarkable things about him is that he converted to Islam while deployed to Guantanamo. As you can imagine, that did not go well for him. And he's having a hard time now that he has received his early but honorable discharge, as he deals with PTSD from his deployments. It's a point of conversation if you'd like to discuss it. Finally, Rustem, an Uzbek now living in Ireland, was my last stop. We photographed at Kilmainham Jail, a former political prison that's now a museum. So this is the book. We won't do the page turn because I think we need to move on. But the book is Welcome to Camp America inside Guantanamo Bay. There are a few copies at the bookstore. It includes these photographs and more. There are original government documents sort of revealing secret policies and practices carried out in connection with the interrogations and detention of the prisoners held there. There's a legal affidavit. There are a number of essays. There are a lot of different elements. So there are a lot of disparate parts of this story to look at. There's also a copy of the book in the exhibition at the Carriage House that you're free to turn through, as well as some resources, the bibliography on the screen with a download link for any of you interested in doing further research. So I look forward to our conversation, and it's time for the next speaker. Thanks.
Our next speaker is Wells Dixon, a senior staff attorney at the Center for Constitutional Rights, a nonprofit legal and educational organization committed to the creative use of law as a positive force for social change. He specializes in challenging unlawful detentions at the Guantanamo prison. He represents clients in federal court, before the military commissions at Guantanamo, and in various international proceedings. Among his clients are former Baltimore area resident Maggie, who was imprisoned and tortured in secret CIA black sites for more than 3 years before he was transferred to Guantanamo, as well as David Hicks, an Australian citizen and one of the first men taken to Guantanamo after 9/11. Prior to coming to the Center for Constitutional Rights, he worked at Kramer, Levin, Naftalis, and Frankel, LLP, where he specialized in white-collar criminal defense and securities litigation. He's a graduate of the University of Colorado School of Law and a former law clerk to federal judge Christopher F. Droney in Connecticut. He's frequently cited as a Guantanamo expert in major news outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Miami Herald, and MSNBC, among others. Please welcome Wells Dixon.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Professor Egan, Professor Whitfield. Thank you to the Center for Public Humanities for inviting me to come and speak to you today. It's always great to see my friend Debi and to to reflect on so many of these individuals who I've known for so many years, and to, I always see something new, and it's amazing to me. I also very much look forward to hearing from Mr. Slahi, who I understand is going to speak afterward. Mr. Slahi, if you don't know, his story is synonymous with torture and abuse at Guantanamo, and someone I've never met but have been familiar with for a long time. So I very much look forward to that. But I'm going to begin with a bit of a confession, which is it's very hard for me to believe that we're still here talking about Guantanamo, almost 16 years after the prison opened. I think back to the time when I was a corporate lawyer, and since then it's been 12 years that I've been representing Guantanamo detainees, including a number of the men that you've seen in Debi's photographs. Most of my clients have been released. I mean, I've represented, I think, between 40 and 45 men in Guantanamo over 12 years. Most have been released. Most have gone on to live very quiet lives, and they continue to struggle with many of the things that we take for granted every day, the little things in life. Where am I going to live? Am I going to have enough money for clothes, for food? And really, how am I going to get over what for most of them was one of the absolute worst periods in their lives, and that is Guantanamo. I spent a lot of time with Jamel Mezian, the Algerian. I spent a lot of time with him, maybe even half of my time with him every day, talking to him, emailing with him, trying to help him get over the 12 years that he spent in Guantanamo. It's very hard. It's very, very hard to do, but it's an important part of our work. There are 41 men who remain, as Professor Whitfield said, including half a dozen men who are represented by my organization, the Center for Constitutional Rights, and by me specifically. 5 of the men who remain are approved for transfer. And what that means is that every military, intelligence, law enforcement agency with a stake in Guantanamo has decided these men don't pose a threat to anybody, and yet they're still there. And some of them have been cleared for release since 2009. But they're still there, and they're very unlikely to go anywhere in the next few years, which is something I'm going to talk about. Most of the men, however, are just held in indefinite detention. They're not cleared for transfer, they're not designated for prosecution, and they are just not charged or accused of any sort of crimes. Yet they've been there in most instances since 2002. It's remarkable. If you think back to 2002, I think Guantanamo has existed for so long at this point that it's really become part of the American landscape. When we travel to Guantanamo now, as I do every several months, we encounter and interact with the guard force. And most of these guards are too young to remember a time before 9/11. In other words, they just don't remember the world before Guantanamo. At the same time, many of them are completely unaware of the history of Guantanamo. They're not aware of the images that you've seen. They may not have ever encountered some of these individuals who were released 1, 2, 5, 10 years ago from Guantanamo. They just don't know the history. I think to understand the history, you have to think back to 9/11, as we did earlier this week with the anniversary of 9/11. And that time invokes many different images. Certainly the Twin Towers and the aftermath of those attacks, but also the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan in October of 2001, because that's the time when the U.S. began to round up men and boys from all over the world. All of them were Muslim, right? The only people who've ever been transferred to Guantanamo are Muslim. And you remember the images. I mean, the images we saw today of the men in the orange jumpsuits, kneeling in the sun with the hoods over their heads, living in cages that look like dog kennels, right? I want you to think about that image, and I want you to sort of footnote that image, because I'm going to come back to that, right? In Guantanamo, this was not an accident, right? None of this was an accident. Guantanamo was chosen because it was thought to be entirely outside the law. You know, it was the legal equivalent of outer space. It was a legal black hole. This is what we were told. And it rested on three principles. The first was isolation. You know, we're going to take people and we're going to transfer them thousands of miles from the world that they know. The second principle was secrecy. We're not going to let anybody in to see what we're doing. And the third was dependency. Again, what we saw with the comfort items. If you want something, you ask your interrogator, right? These are the three principles of Guantanamo. And I'll say parenthetically, with respect to isolation, there's a very, very powerful op-ed in today's New York Times written by a former detainee called "In Our Prison on the Sea." And it was about prisoners from Afghanistan who'd never seen the ocean. When they get to Guantanamo, they can sense the ocean is there, but they can't see it. And they ask the other prisoners to describe for them what the ocean is, right? It's very powerful. But the idea was that the U.S. would take these men and boys and they would bring them to Guantanamo and they would do to them whatever they wanted for however long they wanted, free of interference from the public, from the press, and most importantly, from the courts. Now, the notion that the U.S. would try to create a law-free zone anywhere in the world was one that our organization rejected categorically. And in 2002, a month after the prison opened, we began to file cases, legal cases, seeking writs of habeas corpus. You may not know what a writ of habeas corpus is. Habeas corpus is a common law mechanism. It goes back to Magna Carta in the 13th century. It's basically an equitable doctrine that says if you're being detained unlawfully, you can call your jailer to account in front of a judge, right? So we're not talking about people who've been charged with crimes or convicted of crimes. You want to think sort of a historical equivalent. Think about a peasant who's been thrown into the Tower of London by the king and manages to scratch on a piece of paper, "Help me, I'm being held illegally." That makes its way to a court, right? The court can issue a writ of habeas corpus and the king then has to justify the detention. It's that basic. These are the cases that we filed trying to get that writ of habeas corpus granted. We filed the first cases in February 2002, and really for the next 2 years, we fought with the US government in court about whether these men even had the right to challenge their detention. You know, do they even have the right to get inside the courthouse door to say, "Hey, I'm being held here unlawfully"? We went to the Supreme Court, and in 2004, in a case called Rasul, the Supreme Court said, yes, these men have the right to challenge their detention, and that's when lawyers from my office started to go to Guantanamo and to meet with the men who are there, the men you've seen today, men like Mr. Slahi, and to hear their stories and to figure out exactly what was happening to these men. And that ultimately gave way to really a second phase of the Guantanamo litigation, which was between 2004 and 2008. You had the United States Congress and the Bush administration trying to undo the Rasul decision, that is, trying to pass laws to take away the right of these men to challenge their detention. And so there was a back and forth between Congress and the courts during this period of time over whether the detainees really should have the right to challenge their detention. And all the while, mind you, these men were suffering torture and abuse thousands of miles from their home with little access to the outside world. You know, first they were in Camp X-Ray, the outdoor cages where they were brutalized physically, they were humiliated. And really by 2006, held in Camps 5 and 6, which we also saw images of. These are the maximum security prisons with the completely white walls, right, where the abuse became much more psychological. Right? We're just going to put you in isolation and leave you there 23, 24 hours a day. It was a human rights disaster that I think we'll probably hear more about from Mr. Slahi. And I think, you know, if you think back, maybe you remember Amnesty International said that Guantanamo had become the gulag of our times, and that was in 2005, right? So it was like 12 years ago. But eventually in 2008, the Supreme Court decided another case called Boumediene, and they said that Congress just can't take away the right of these men to get inside the courthouse door because that right is rooted in our Constitution, can't be undone by legislation. And that led to sort of a period of time between 2008 and really the end of the Obama administration, which was characterized really by individual challenges to legality of detention. You know, we were finally in the courthouse doors. We started to litigate for men like Amesian. A lot of these men started to get cleared for transfer very quickly. So rather than litigate, the Obama administration just cleared a lot of people for transfer. It was also a time where Congress continued to try to make it difficult to close the prison, right? They tried to impose all sorts of restrictions on transfers and make it difficult. And as we know, President Obama failed to close the prison. Now, historians, I'm sure, are going to study what happened and why Guantanamo wasn't closed. And there is indeed already a good deal of finger-pointing about who is responsible. There's a lot of assignment of blame as between the President Obama, and members of Congress about who did what and why Guantanamo is still open. But I think there are a few things that are already clear, right? One is that President Obama started out very well on Guantanamo, right? He signed an executive order on his second day in office saying, look, we're going to close the prison within a year, began to transfer a lot of men out of Guantanamo. But by 2010, he really sort of lost his nerve in the face of political opposition and pulled back, right? And there are a couple of things that happened early on that led this to happen. One was an effort by the Obama administration in the very first year to bring some of the Chinese Uyghurs, some of the men you saw in Debi's photographs, into the United States to resettle them in Virginia, right? These are men who couldn't be returned to China for fear of persecution. It was very difficult to find a place to send them, so there was an effort to bring them to Virginia and resettle them there. Right? That would have been an example to the world that these men were not dangerous. It would have been encouraging to other countries to accept other men from Guantanamo. But word leaked out to Congress, and Representative Frank Wolf from Northern Virginia went crazy. I don't know how else to put it. And there was a political firestorm, and President Obama backed away from that. He also backed away after Christmas Day, I think it was 2009, when a man named Abdul Muttalib tried to bomb a US-bound airliner. He was Nigerian, but had apparently trained in Yemen. And as a consequence of that and the political fallout from that, President Obama imposed a moratorium on transfers out of Guantanamo to Yemen. Right? This is not something that was legally required. It's something he decided to do in the face of political opposition, which led to a standstill in transfers from Guantanamo for many, many years. I don't think one detainee since then has been transferred back to Yemen, and that was pursuant to a court order. So the president lost his nerve by 2010 and really sort of turned his back on Guantanamo. At the same time this was happening, President Obama, his administration was going to court, and they were claiming really the same power that the Bush administration had claimed, which is to do whatever they wanted to these men for as long as they wanted without interference. And President Bush said, laws don't apply to me. President Obama said, the laws do apply to me, but they let me do what I want to do. So they took a different approach, but the bottom line was the same. We're going to do whatever we want to whomever we want for as long as we want. And so by 2008, we start litigating these cases, and we win about 75 to 80% of our cases at the trial court level. By the time we get to the Court of Appeals, again, around 2010, the Court of Appeals starts to indicate very quickly that it's going to do whatever the administration wants. It's going to let the administration hold people on little more than it says so. So, we're finally inside the courthouse door, we're litigating these cases, only to find out that these men don't really have meaningful substantive rights. And that became very convenient for the Obama administration, right? The president says we want to close Guantanamo, we're clearing people for transfer, but rather than transfer people, by 2010, it becomes much more convenient for the administration just to appeal, knowing full well that the Court of Appeals will stop those transfers and will allow the administration to continue to do what it wants. So the bottom line is, by 2010, momentum was completely gone. Right? President Obama turns his back on Guantanamo, and Congress steps in to fill the void. Beginning in January of 2011, Congress passes a series of laws to try to make it more difficult to close the prison. Not impossible, but difficult. As a result, there are almost no transfers for a period of 2.5 years, from January 2011 2011 through the late summer of 2013. It's only after a hunger strike, a massive hunger strike at the prison that begins in April of 2013, that transfers begin to resume again. By that point, there's concern that it's becoming too late in the Obama administration to close the prison. Right? The president still has the power and the authority to do this, to close the prison, to take steps to make it happen, but is politically unwilling to do that. Right? Continues to fight us, continues to fight every detainee challenge in court, even in the case of people like Mr. Mezian, where the administration has cleared them for transfer years earlier. I mean, it made absolutely no sense, right? It was somewhat schizophrenic. The president saying, I want to close the prison, I'm going to do everything I can to close the prison, yet continuing to fight us up until the last to prevent these men from getting out. And this became a critical problem after President Trump was elected, right? There were a number of men who were approved for transfer who got out of Guantanamo in the very last weeks of the Obama administration. And there were two men who didn't get out, an Algerian and a Moroccan. And we went to court about a month before the inauguration to try to get a court order to force these men out. And we went to the Obama administration, we went to the White House and said, don't fight us, right? You've approved these people for transfer, don't fight us, agree. Let's get a court order, let's get these people out. You've said you want to transfer them, we need to get them out. And the administration fought us. They fought us literally up till the day before President Trump was inaugurated to prevent a court from ordering these men out. And again, it made no sense. In the end, while Congress made it harder for Guantanamo to close, the blame lies with the Obama administration, right? The Algerian, the Moroccan, they're still in Guantanamo. And they're going to suffer the consequences along with the other 39 men who remain there. Right? They're going to suffer the consequences of what not only the Bush administration did, but as a consequence of the arguments advanced by the Obama administration, right? This idea that they could do whatever they wanted to with these men, albeit cloaked in law. So when we look ahead to, we look at the Trump administration, right? I think it's important to remember, again, when you think about Guantanamo, Obama took essentially the same position as the Bush administration, right? We can do whatever we want to whomever we want for as long as we want. But what Obama did that was different was said, look, as a matter of policy, or as a matter of by applying sort of normative principles like respect for human rights, we're gonna close Guantanamo. We're gonna do what's right, right? So in other words, he's saying we have the power to do whatever we want, but we're gonna do what's right and what's good and what's just as a matter of policy. Right? This was an approach not just to closing Guantanamo, but to all sorts of things, right? To killing people with drones, right? Obama was the drone president, right? Says we have authority to kill anybody, including American citizens, with a drone, but we're going to impose all sorts of restrictions, policy restrictions on how we do that, and it's going to be in very limited circumstances, et cetera, et cetera. We see this with warrantless surveillance by the National Security Agency, and we see it with DACA, right? The president, his entire DACA policy was rooted in policy, not in law, right? And in retrospect, that was a catastrophic mistake, a catastrophic miscalculation by the Obama administration. Talking to people who are now out of the administration, I think they're beginning to realize this. This was a catastrophic mistake. Because by rooting their actions in policy or normative principles rather than law, they've left the door open for the Trump administration to say, look, we have as much power as the Obama administration did legally to do what we want to do, whether that's kill people with drones or keep them in Guantanamo or engage in military action in Syria. But we're going to jettison these policy restraints, right? We're going to get rid of these normative principles which are holding us back. And we've seen this already, right? We've seen this in Syria with and Somalia and Yemen with a loosening of military rules of engagement, right? They have pulled back the rules of engagement outside of what they call active zones of hostilities. And we see the results, right? Which is a massive spike in civilian casualties as a result of US bombings and dronings. This leads to the question, well, what's going to happen with the Trump administration and Guantanamo? I think the only honest and clear answer is, as with all things Trump related, we don't know from day to day what's going to happen, but we're certain it's going to be bad, right? Trump certainly made clear during the election and since the election his view that Guantanamo should remain open. And early on in the administration, we saw leaked drafts of executive orders that would bring back the CIA rendition and torture program. We continue to hear about draft executive orders that would require the transfer of new detainees to Guantanamo. Right? And what we're talking about here when we talk about bringing new people to Guantanamo, filling up Guantanamo with bad dudes, as the president says, we're really talking about ISIS fighters captured in Syria and Iraq. You may have seen news reports yesterday that there was an American citizen fighting for ISIS who surrendered to Kurdish forces and has been turned over to the US, to the Pentagon. And I spent a good part of yesterday trying to figure out who that person is, right? And whether that person has family here in the United States that we could contact to try to help them. But that's what we're talking about, right? There's a real risk that this person, American citizen, will be brought to Guantanamo, right? And that has all sorts of implications. From a human rights perspective, certainly it's devastating. I mean, it would compound the tragedy of Guantanamo. As we've seen, it's very easy to put someone in Guantanamo, and it's very, very difficult to get them out. It would also have diplomatic consequences. It would alienate our U.S. allies, certainly in Europe, but also in parts of the Middle East. There was an individual with dual Algerian and Irish citizenship who was recently brought to Philadelphia for criminal prosecution, and my understanding is there had been a debate about whether to bring this person to Guantanamo, but the Spanish and the Irish said absolutely not. We won't cooperate. We won't turn this person over unless you agree that they're not going to come to Guantanamo. So bringing ISIS fighters to Guantanamo would have tremendous diplomatic implications. But it would be entirely consistent with President Trump's promises to his political base, right? Entirely consistent with what we at the center view as his anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant, white supremacist agenda, right? If there is any silver lining, though, to this, ironically, it would create an opportunity for us as lawyers to challenge his agenda, right? It would give us, if he brings someone from ICE who he says is connected with ISIS to Guantanamo, it would give us standing or the opportunity to go to court and challenge the use of force in Syria. So not just the detention of such an individual, but the entire military operation in connection with operations in Syria and Iraq. Right? Because all of that is predicated on a law called the Authorization for Use of Military Force. All of Guantanamo rests on this law that was passed on September 18th, 2001. And basically all it says is the president can use necessary and appropriate force against those people who attacked us on 9/11, right? All of Guantanamo rests on this. Warrantless surveillance rests on this. U.S. military action in Somalia, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, all rests on this law. You may say, as we say, well, what does that have to do with ISIS, right? ISIS didn't exist at the time of 9/11. ISIS is fighting al-Qaeda, right? How can you bring someone to Guantanamo you say is connected with ISIS based on this law, right? Well, that's exactly the kind of legal challenge we would make. We would say, look, this law just doesn't justify detention. And if we win on that, it has implications, again, not just for the individual, but also for the entire military strategy in Syria. The Justice Department lawyers know this, right? The State Department lawyers know this. They know that there's legal risk in transferring new detainees to Guantanamo. We remind them of this every chance we get, right? This is the legal risk that they face is deterrent, right? It is probably the only reason that there hasn't actually been a transfer to Guantanamo since Trump came into office. But the president could wake up one day and roll out of bed on the wrong side of the bed and transfer someone to Guantanamo impulsively, right? Like the way he fired the FBI director Comey, right? Just do it and let the chips fall where they may. Nobody really knows whether that's going to happen. I think as best we can tell, there's no one in the White House right now who is really driving an effort to bring a new detainee to Guantanamo, right? We thought that maybe it was Steve Bannon or Sebastian Gorka or someone like this, and that having departed might change the scenario, but that doesn't really seem to be the case, right? It doesn't seem that there's a particular individual in the White House who is pushing transfers to Guantanamo, but it is clearly part of President Trump's overall counterterrorism strategy. So we think the issue is unlikely to go away, right? I think for it to go away entirely, it would require the Secretary of Defense, Mattis, or General Kelly, who's the Chief of Staff, or H.R. McMaster, the National Security Advisor, to intervene and say, we're not going to do this. But they're so preoccupied with other issues right now that I think it's unlikely that they're going to take that step to intervene. If I had to predict what will happen, this is just really speculation, I think we're most likely going to see an executive order from the Trump administration that says, we're not going to close Guantanamo, we're going to add new detainees, right? That's what's most likely, but I think that's going to be more in the nature of a press release than an actual mandate. I think it is a very different thing to say, look, on the one hand, we're going to transfer someone to Guantanamo. It's a very different thing to actually do it, to actually take the steps to bring someone to Guantanamo. And I think there are all sorts of implications if that happens. So we're very likely to see an executive order, but I think it's more questionable whether we'll actually see someone brought to Guantanamo. But if it happens, look, I mean, we will file a legal challenge immediately to this, and it'll be interesting to see how the courts react. Again, the Bush administration lost the Guantanamo challenges before the Supreme Court. Really, I think, because in retrospect, they claimed that no law applied to them. Law didn't constrain them. The Obama administration, again, took a different approach. They claimed broad authority, but they said, no, the law does apply to us, and we're going to do the right thing anyway, which is to close Guantanamo. And we think that the courts gave the Obama administration a lot of deference because of that, right? They were willing to give the Obama administration time and space, and they were unwilling to really force their hand. But President Trump is a different story, right? He's demonstrated repeated hostility to the courts. He's attacked federal judges, and it's really hurt him. If you look at the travel ban litigation that's ongoing, it's largely failed. And if you look at some of the decisions out of the Ninth Circuit, Court of Appeals, they cite his statements against him, right? His disrespect for the law and for the judges and for the courts gets cited against him. So it'll be interesting to see what happens if we have to go to court to challenge the Trump administration over new transfers to Guantanamo. It's also, be interesting to see what happens with respect to legal challenges on behalf of the 41 men who remain. We are going to see new legal challenges. We are going to be filing new legal challenges for those men in the coming weeks or months. And they'll be couched largely in terms of the Trump administration's disrespect for the rule of law and the failure to transfer anyone out of Guantanamo, including those 5 men who were approved for transfer and have been since 2009. If I were a Trump administration official, I might be slightly concerned about that, right, if I were even aware of it, but we can only speculate as to what they might do. I do want to note one other thing with respect to the consequences of failing to close the prison. That is to go back to this image of the men in the orange jumpsuits, right? There's no doubt, among all the uncertainty that continues to exist around Guantanamo, there's no doubt that the continuing existence of Guantanamo emboldens terrorism and it hurts national security, right? Hurts the national security of the United States. And that's not a theme that we as human rights lawyers are often press, right? That's just not our take on Guantanamo. But it is one that I think is important, and I think it's true, right? Guantanamo hurts the national security interests of the United States. And I say that because there's no coincidence if you see those terrible videos, the ISIS videos, you see the images, right, of the executions. It's not a coincidence that ISIS puts its victims in orange jumpsuits, in cages with hoods over their head, out in the sun, right? That is a nod to Guantanamo, and that is a nod to 16 years of torture and abuse and misery for Muslims, right? They're doing that to troll the United States, right, on social media. You know, so even if you're Donald Trump or you're a member of that administration, or you just don't care about human rights, right, you might want to stop and think seriously about Guantanamo and how it undermines U.S. national security, right? Is it worth it to bring new detainees to Guantanamo to score some political points with your base? You might ask yourself, you know, why is it that in 2017, the only people who really, truly support the continued existence of Guantanamo, right, from a policy perspective, like who think this is a really good idea, are, you know, people like neo-Nazis, right, who hate Muslims and just think, you know, these are terrorists, forget about them, they deserve it, right, in the words of the president. Or ISIS, right, which sees Guantanamo as a propaganda windfall, right? This is the way they recruit and motivate their forces, right? No matter how you look at it, you know, Guantanamo is a terrible idea. Keeping it open is a terrible idea from a human rights perspective, from a practical perspective. It doesn't make any sense. Like other notorious island prisons, right? Devil's Island, Robben Island. Guantanamo is tainted, right? It's tainted by 16 years of torture and abuse. I think another 4 or 5 or 10 or 15 years of Guantanamo isn't going to change that, right? But I think sadly, you know, it's as likely as not that it's going to continue to exist, right? It's going to continue to be part of the American landscape. And all of us are going to have to continue to pick up and deal with the wreckage of Guantanamo, right? Whether it's the legal challenges for the men who remain, right? Trying to keep those men sane, right? When there are so few people in Guantanamo now that you know, there are fewer people in Guantanamo maybe than there are in this room. Or to try to help these men who've been released move on with their lives, right? To forget about the worst possible thing that you can imagine, right? We're going to continue to have to deal with this, and it's very unfortunate. Thank you.
Thank you. After attending high school in his native Mauritania, Mohamedou Ould Slahi won a full scholarship to study microelectronics and telecommunications in Germany. After more than a decade studying and working in Germany as an electrical engineer, he returned to Mauritania in 2000. On November 20th, 2001, he reported to Mauritanian police for questioning. From there, he was forcibly disappeared. He was renditioned to Jordan and then to Afghanistan, and finally transferred to Guantanamo on August 5th, 2002, where he was subjected to a brutal, year-long special project interrogation. He spent 14 years in arbitrary detention in Guantanamo. He was finally released and transferred home to Mauritania on October 16th, 2016. Slahi is the author of the international bestseller Guantánamo Diary, published in 2015, an account of his time in detention, written in detention, and mediated by editor Larry Seam's footnotes and the redacted black bars inserted by the US government. An interview with Slahi was broadcast on CBS's 60 Minutes in March 2017. Slahi joins us via video conference from Mauritania. Thank you.
Hi, I hope you can hear me. Thank you, Marisa. I can see you. Flash. Thank you very much, John from Center for Public Cultural Heritage. I feel a bit intimidated by the other guests. And to tell you the truth, they didn't leave me anything to say. That is Debi and Wells. They said everything I wanted to say. And I thank them very much. I can only second them in everything they have said. So my story is like that of many young Muslims from this part of the world that is North Africa and the Middle East. It was a story of complete disregard and even contempt to the rule of law. You know, this Securitate state, that's what I call it, that is the US security apparatus, they have a second thought about the Constitution, the US Constitution and the rule of law. That is, they don't work. To them, they don't work. If you want to get caught down and dirty, you cannot use the rule of law. And Guantanamo Bay, you guys know about Guantanamo Bay only after Guantanamo Bay was built in January of 2002. Guantanamo Bay, in this sense, has always existed. I was put under house arrest since January of 2000 when I was kidnapped from Senegal on January 21st of 2000 in an intelligence operation between the Canadian government, Mauritanian government, Senegalese government, led by the United States of America. And this all was done to shortcut the rule of law, completely undercut anything that is resembling due process of law. So, and I was, when I reported, as Marisa already said, there was no Guantanamo Bay. So I was sent to Jordan for torture. There was Guantanamo Bay in Mauritania, there was Guantanamo Bay in Jordan. And I cannot get my head wrapped around one thing. Why is it okay for US citizens and German citizens and Scottish citizens to put their foot down and say, no, this is my right, and I'm not going to accept that the government takes this right away from me? Why? And it is not acceptable for me as a Mauritanian citizen to say so. This is, you know, Guantanamo Bay was built to fight violent extremism. But for all intents and purposes, Guantanamo Bay has been a tool to promote and sponsor, unfortunately, extremism. And people who pay the heaviest price are us in this part of the world, not the US, not Europe, not the Western world. We bear the brunt because our young people join these extremist groups, and they do so much damage to us before they do it to anyone. Now, you know, my struggle, this is very funny because at least in Guantanamo Bay we have lawyers. We can talk to people like Wells, like my lawyer, Nancy Holland. In Mauritania, I have no legal recourse. And Debi mentioned when she tried nicely to intervene to help release former detainees in Albania. And she said that the US Embassy wouldn't step in. I would say the US Embassy would step in, but just to give the marching orders and how to treat those detainees. Now I have a problem. I've been through an operation in Guantanamo Bay, and something went wrong in the operation. And for months now, I couldn't sleep. So my doctor suggested that I seek medical treatment in Germany, so where my brother, part of my family, live. So, but Mauritanian government wouldn't give me a travel document. And when I asked them, why? Did I do something wrong? Did I break the law? Am I a convicted felon? They say no. US government told us not to. So I called my lawyer. My lawyer said, you have no business in asking for that in the US from a legal point of view, because I'm neither a US citizen nor do I live in the United States of America. So no judge would even look at my file. So, and Mauritanian government were very clear with me. they are the first to blame because they have no regard for the rule of law. And they told me, look, the United States tells us, if you can do it, but if you do it, I will punish you. So, because this part of the world is ruled by no law, and this rule by no law is sponsored by the United States of America. Partially, not the whole blame is not to be put on the US, but partially the blame, a very big portion of the blame to put on the US by enabling these authoritarian regimes that we have to live under. I didn't choose to be born here, but I was born here, and I live under a state that has no regard for the rule of law. But they wouldn't hurt you unless you challenge them. You want to be the president or the prime minister. But one of their main sponsors is the United States government. So they would tell me, you cannot have it because the US says so. So go to the US and ask them. If I wrote the United States Embassy, I wrote them 3 times, but they wouldn't respond. They wouldn't receive me because I just want to discuss with them. They cleared me. When my lawyer brought me the clearance, that I was cleared for release, and Wells could tell you about this process. I was cleared by FBI, CIA, Homeland Security, Immigration, Military Intelligence, and other organizations I never heard of. So I told them, wow, this is a much higher standard than security clearance that lawyers get when they get to Guantanamo Bay. They were laughing. They said, that's correct. I said, I should consider getting this clearance myself. The point being that this is what the United States does to break the law, international humanitarian law, is in secret. And this is a real problem for us. And how can I explain to young people in this country that American people can get their rights, can challenge the government, German people can challenge the government, but in this part of the world, we cannot face the government. Why? Because the most powerful country in the world is sponsoring and helping the government to break the law. And I can only appeal to the good people like yourself to be aware of this. And I understand the challenges that extremism poses, whether it's Muslim extremism or neo-Nazism and neo-fascism. I understand that, completely understand. But the best way to fight this is to tell, for instance, these young Muslim and Arabs here, we will not treat you different than anyone else. We don't care about your religion. We don't care about your background or the lack thereof, the religion. We will treat you within the bounds of the rule of law. This is, I don't know any stronger statement to fight extremism, even terrorism, than this statement. And a little bit about this book. This book was even, like Wells said, when you want to break the law, you don't want any witness or witnesses, plural. And this book was written as a news in 2005. When I was allowed to see lawyers, I wrote them a series of letters describing what happened to me. But the government fought every step of the way, tooth and nail, to prevent my lawyers to publish my letters. And it took about 7.5 years. And finally, they gave it to us as a damaged property. So, but the good news, when I was released last October, I set out to restore the book. And next month, you will be able to read the whole thing without censorship. And yes, thank you very much again for having me. And there are so many things I really want to say, and so many things that my previous speakers have said. They stole my lines, thankfully. And thank you very much for having me again.
Well, thank you very much to everybody who has spoken here this morning. I think there are a lot of threads for us to think about, to tie together here. Thank you very much, Mohamedou. Would anybody like to start with a question for any of our speakers who are here? Anywhere you'd like to go? I'll start with a question from Mohamedou then. Which mic should I use?
Those are all on.
Those are all on, okay.
And actually,
Yeah. Mohamedou, thank you so much for speaking to us. It's really an honor to have you here. It's really actually unbelievable to be seeing you here. Can you tell us a little bit about the process of reconstructing your diary? And, if you don't mind, what we might expect from the different version that is, I presume you're going to look different as well as read differently. Can you tell us how you work through that process?
The name again?
My name is Esther. Esther Whitfield. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Esther. Very easy.
Okay.
So, most of the
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, we can see that. Okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
names
Uh-huh.
of people and places
Mm-hmm.
and dates.
Mm-hmm.
So those small things I could recall very easy.
Mm-hmm.
There was no problem.
Yeah.
The real problem started when I get
Right. Yeah.
there was nothing. I had to break my head against the wall to remember the content. So then we have to, I have to rewrite what happened, but without using the exact same words that I use, because I don't remember them. And so the new edition will look something like this. I just copied this. There is a light shading just to reveal what was redacted, just for the reader, and without hurting the eyes or the comfort of the reader.
Yeah.
So there is one thing that I've discovered during my discussions with publishers and people. People in the United States are freaked out. So there is also self-censorship. And certain things that the government wouldn't accept. So they have to change these things like names. They wouldn't, because there are people in the government whose names supposedly cannot be known. But I am seeing myself as only loyal to my reader. So in my speeches and to my readers, I will tell them the name. And another thing, when back in the day, Guantanamo was built, like vast majority of American people said, we don't care. That's for Muslim young men. It's not for us. Today, like the karma. I have American friends who visit me. When they go back to the United States, they are scared because they will have to give their social media, their password, everything to the authorities. No one would have imagined that to be possible.
Well, thank you. I really look forward to reading that. Gosh, would you like to come and sit here so we can get some more questions? Great.
Assalamu alaikum. I wanted to say thank you so much for being here. And by the way, I'm a student at the university. My name is Amara. I read your book over the summer, and it was honestly one of the most just powerful, mind-blowing reads ever. And I really appreciate you sharing your story here and in the book. So I have two questions. So the first is, what could have possibly given you strength during the time that you spent there? What kept you going? And the second is, how do you cope now? Like, how can you possibly cope with just all of the time that was taken away from you? And, I read about all the heartbreak that went along with, your family and all of these things, and, the letters your family wrote to you during your time there. Like, I don't know, how do you cope with all of the, the resentment you must feel, or any feelings that you have?
Wa alaikum salam, Amanda. Thank you very much for the question. So, as to how I cope, I would say something that is very bad to say. I would say, this belief in that I didn't believe that they were serious in telling me that I did some horrific stuff. I always thought, this is a dream. This is just a bad dream. This is impossible, because if I had done something, I would have known. So those people must be crazy, or they would figure it out, and then in the end they will let me go. So I really don't know. To be honest, I really don't know. But what I did know that I did so much work on myself not to hate anyone, and not to punish myself more than necessary. Meaning, I'm here already, and I have very little control over what is happening to me. But I have control over myself, over my sanity, over my head. So I start to concentrate on other things. I pray, I meditated, and I try to be nice to all people, regardless of who they are, guards, detainees, anyone. And that's made it really very easy for me to work. And also I started to analyze why Americans are so angry. So I saw them in, I know Americans through American movies in Germany, married with children. I said, married with children are very happy people. But why are they so angry?
I've got something to add briefly to that. First of all, hello, Mohamedou. This is Debi Cornwall. We've been in touch on social media, so it's wonderful to be able to speak this way on a panel with you and hear your voice. Just in response to the question that you asked about coping, one of the things that you talked about, and that is clear from hearing you speak about your experience, Mohamedou, is your sense of humor. And in my work with exonerees within the United States, resilience and what makes up resilience is a question that I've asked for a long time, and what you clearly have in common with others who are surviving and coping is, what it sounds like is, you are able to make some peace with your circumstances even as you fought to change them, and you're able to laugh. And that is something that I've seen among my former clients in the United States, those who are functioning as opposed to those who are having an even harder time managing the trauma.
Hi, my name is Rachel. I'm a Brown grad from long ago. I have a question for you, Wells. You referred to the legislation passed in September of 2001, and I'm just wondering, has any of the rest of this, the behavior of the United States government in the last 16 years, been supported by any congressional actions or any other legislation?
The answer is really no. It's just been this 2001 law, which was it was just a resolution. It says that, again, that the president can use necessary and appropriate force in response to the people who attacked us on 9/11. It's very much tied to 9/11. Now, there have been congressional appropriations bills that have funded things like military action in Syria, or there have been bills that have affected the way that Guantanamo transfers occur, for example, imposing sort of bureaucratic paperwork requirements. But really, fundamentally, it's still this one law. And there is a debate going on right now. Actually, it was happening yesterday in Congress, in part about repealing and replacing that authorization, trying to come up with a new war authority bill, because I think there's recognition, certainly in Congress, and it's going to come eventually in the courts, that the courts are going to say that this 2001 law is it's bearing more weight than it can support. So it's going to continue to be debated, I think.
Can I just add one more thing?
Yeah.
First of all, thank you for the work that you've done, and you and your colleagues. And I'm just wondering, so given that I guess most of this is being fought in the courts, is there anything for your average American to do to support those efforts, or, I don't know, to push Congress?
Yeah, that's a great question. Absolutely. I mean, if the easiest thing to do is visit our website, ccrjustice.org. We are a nonprofit legal and educational organization. So I'm a lawyer. I litigate cases. I spend a lot of time in Washington, talking to people in government. But we have an entire component of our work that is education and outreach, advocacy type work, and so we are constantly have events and are engaging in sort of public outreach to try to achieve certain things, whether it's a change in legislation, or whether it's trying to help a former detainee achieve some goal, and we're constantly looking for support. So visit our website. We have a colleague of mine, Aliyah Hussein, is her entire raison d'etre is to engage in non-litigation advocacy with the public. Yeah.
Thank you so much, everyone. My name's Jenny. I'm a graduate student in literature. I went to an event with Debi earlier this week, and I've been thinking about representation and dialogue, and your book is in Arabic and English.
Yes.
And I was interested, Mohamedou, to think about how you think about audience, or maybe you could speak to that too, Debi, and kind of dialogue around Guantanamo and the representations and literature that comes out around that.
I'll start, since you referred to the book. So one thing I neglected to mention here today is that all of the text in my book is in both English and Arabic. And that was for two reasons that were very important to me. One is it's critical for us to be in conversation with the population most impacted, Muslims, Arabic speakers around the world. And secondly, I wanted to send a message to English-only speakers that we live in a broader world. We are connected. These questions of balancing rights and fears and the so-called war on terror and our constitutional values cannot be handled or resolved in a bubble. So I wanted to be breaching both of that divide and reaching those audiences. And Mohamedou, how many languages has your memoir now been published in?
I think 30, about 30.
So you're reaching a truly international audience. I think you've got your books in the background there with all of the languages. And it's such a moving story that it's relevant and of interest across the world. Yeah. Amazing. Yeah. Just about every language that there is.
Mohamedou, could I ask how you imagine your audience?
Are you asking Mohamedou sort of who he imagines will be reading when he's doing the writing?
Yeah. I heard the question. I try to formulate it in a way that is consistent with my memory back then. So, you know this saying, shouting in the dark. So, we have a saying in Arabic, if your tribe says you're blind, you better get a cane. So all people around me told me, you are a bad man. Every single person that I meet in Guantanamo Bay tells me, you are a bad man. And then I was then young, and I defined myself by what people say. So I wanted to reach to other people, explain to them what happened, and to hear whether I'm really a bad man or just an average, regular person from West Africa. And I found that I'm just an average, regular person, not too smart, not too dumb, not too rich, not too poor, from West Africa.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum, Mohamedou. My name is Zainab. I'm an undergraduate student here at Brown. I want to start off by saying thank you so much for being here and for sharing your story. I really, really appreciate it. And I honestly just wanted to say that the fact that you have found the strength to truly forgive all those that have wronged you, even though your life is affected by this every single day, is just so inspiring. And I just hope I aspire to find the strength that you do one day, because I don't know if I would ever be able to forgive and to find that peace that you say you have found. So thank you. And I just also want to ask what a day in your life looks like right now. And I'm also wondering if you ever get a chance to see your family and just like how your life is right now.
in Mauritania?
Thank you very much, Anna, for this good sentiment. I beg to differ, like that people are not able to forgive. I believe in goodness in people, honestly. And I think I did not want to forgive at the beginning. I want revenge. I want to get back at those people who hurt me, who hurt my family and so. But I was analyzing, reading, thinking. And then it's like a eureka moment. Voila. I found that the best revenge is to forgive. Because that gives me control back. I'm in complete control. And forgiveness is not for the people. Absolutely. It's for me. Like, let's say, because we are very subjective when it comes to feeling. So I feel I'm being wrong. That's very subjective. Maybe I'm not wrong. So you go to this person, a friend, say, you know what? You really wronged me, but I forgive you. The friend would say, what are you talking about? I didn't do anything to you. I don't need your forgiveness. My answer would be, but I need my forgiveness. So even if you don't think you wronged me, I still forgive you. So forgiveness, it's for me first and foremost. And it gives me peace inside. The other thing, I will not see my family again because my mother died 2 years before I was released.
Allah yarhamha.
My died one year before I was released.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think Warren had a question. Thanks.
Thank you very much. My name is Warren. I'm a PhD student in Africana Studies here at Brown. And I really appreciated, Mohamedou, your comment on extending the, how we think about Guantanamo Bay beyond just the building itself or the time period of the building and the long history of, U.S. imperialism and occupation as well. And particularly in the context of the Caribbean, and how to link Guantanamo as well to other spaces in the Caribbean that have been, infiltrated by U.S. imperial forces. And, I only came in for J. Wells Dixon's talk. So I'm really curious as to how, your advocacy in the courts, the U.S. courts, but how is it, the advocacy on the international front in terms of indicting the particular structure of the U.S. system, right? The U.S. apparatus in and of itself. What's really interesting in Mohamedou, your statement, and also in your work, it's so connected for me to enslavement and the history of abolition across the Americas. Your work to me reminds me of, like David Walker's Appeal, or to think about other narratives in the Caribbean and the Americas. So where is the kind of international indictment, so to speak, on the one legal front, but also in the advocacy, public advocacy as well? Thank you very much.
Yeah, so you ask a great question, and we do litigate in the United States on behalf of men who are detained to try to obtain their release. That's one very small piece of what we do. We also do a lot of international advocacy and litigation. It is so broad, I will give you a few snapshots. So one of the things that I spent a lot of time doing for many years was traveling around to different countries to try to convince these countries that they should accept men from Guantanamo who couldn't safely be repatriated to their own countries or whose countries wouldn't want to accept them. And so we literally traveled the world. And Mozambique, whose photograph you saw, Debi's presentation came with us to some of those meetings, and we would literally go to talk to foreign ministers and say, look, here's an individual who's detained. We want you to consider contacting the U.S. State Department to talk about resettling this person, because we don't have the power as private individuals to negotiate anything, but we can go and we can ask. And so we spent a great deal of time trying to do that, right? Trying to generate these opportunities with some degree of success, but also with a lot of failure. The biggest challenge oftentimes was to convince other countries that they had any role or responsibility for Guantanamo, right? And they'd say, well, if the U.S. won't take these individuals, why should we, right? What obligation do we have to do this? And we had a very sort of standard, well-rehearsed answer to that, which had to do with the practical effect of, the failure to act is going to mean these people remain, right? The U.S. should be responsible. They are responsible morally, legally, but the reality is they're not going to do this. This was a particularly interesting in the context of Latin America, right? I mean, given where Guantanamo is, in some ways, sort of the countries in the Caribbean and Central America and Latin America sat this out, right? Sat out these issues, didn't really have much involvement or didn't see themselves as having much involvement in the war, so-called war on terror. Even Cuba. We tried to convince the Cubans to agree to take some of the men from Guantanamo, and they had no interest, right? And so we spent a lot of time trying to, countries like Uruguay or Argentina or Chile, right, who have their own histories with militarism. We spent a lot of time trying to convince them to become involved. And in terms of sort of reparations and trying to achieve some measure of accountability, whether that's criminal prosecution for people who tortured or whether it's damages for people who were injured, victimized. We failed completely in the United States, right? We went to court to try to get damages. We tried to convince the Justice Department under the Obama administration to prosecute torturers. We failed. And so one of the things that we've done is we've gone and we've looked increasingly outside of the United States, right, to try to go to other countries and other fora to achieve some measure of accountability and reparations. And so, for example, I was in Mexico City last week arguing a case before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights on behalf of Mr. Mezian, right, whose photograph is up here on the wall. And still trying to convince this regional body of the Organization of American States to issue a decision on the legality of Guantanamo and to order reparations for what had happened within their jurisdiction. And we see other current and former detainees suing in places like the European Court of Human Rights, some of the African human rights bodies. And then we see a number of former detainees suing in their home countries. I mean, Esther mentioned Omar Khadr, sued in Canada. Mohamedou, yeah. And there are, I think we're going to see more of that. People suing their own countries for complicity in Guantanamo. That's the way that people are going to obtain some measure of justice, I think, not from the United States.
Hi, my name is Patsy. I'm also from the Caribbean. So the question of Guantanamo Bay is not just about the current usage of Guantanamo, but the broader historical role of the region and the perspective of Cuba that the whole existence of the U.S. in Cuba is an illegal act. And I think that it's difficult to separate that from the reaction from the Caribbean and Latin America in engaging with detainees from Guantanamo Bay. And in a sense, there might be a way in which people can see it as legitimizing the US's illegal occupation of Cuba. The other side of it is that this is very political. And your example of Mauritania and the government, the US government saying you are not to have a passport, in a sense, it also gives the US some more powerful handle in your country to tell you what to do. So I suspect that all of these issues that are at play, and we cannot forget that, especially in the Caribbean and Latin America, the US, and as you see the OAS, the US dominates the OAS. So it's very difficult. There are consequences to opposing the US on certain things.
We're nearing the end, but there's a question I'd like to ask, partly of Mohamedou and partly of Debi, who I know has worked with a number of people and Wells too. It's around the question of coping and resilience that I think was one of the first questions here. And I think, so the question that was put to you, Mohamedou, how do you cope? How did you cope? And Debi has brought up the question of humor. A number of the testimonies of Guantanamo detainees that I have read have talked about faith and belief, and I believe that this is one of the issues that Terry Holbrooks was very moved by, the fact that there was a sense of faith among detainees that seemed to be in many cases less present in the guards, and this was something to be admired. And the third issue I'd like to bring up is the question of writing. How writing becomes a coping mechanism, and I wish I had done this earlier, but I'd also like to point out, you won't know this, Mohamedou, in the audience we have Jorge Oliveira, who is Cuban, who is a Cuban political prisoner in the Combinado de Guantánamo, which is a high security Cuban prison, very close to where you were in prison, but across an impossible border. Jorge wrote poetry in prison. And I would like to ask you, Mohamedou, what writing and faith meant for you as a prisoner. I think Debi may be able to say something about, and Wells too, about what role faith has in this experience. I don't know if Jorge wants to comment, but Jorge turned to poetry as a prisoner. So maybe you'd like to start on that, Mohamedou. This is Esther again, in case you didn't recognize me. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Esther. Yes, I did. Of course, faith is very important, but faith evolves as we evolve. I mean, not as human, as a person. As I grow up, my understanding of faith changes with time. So it's like when I was a child, so I thought I was just like, a toy, and then God does whatever God wants with me. And then as I grow up, I know that I was a part of the equation. That's my actions and my deeds are part of the equation. So I was not exactly a toy. So I was part of the equation. So, and the other part also that I'm not the only one who lives by faith. Even those people also with me are also living by with their faith. And so I try to understand. I spend so much time trying to understand why America is so interested in me as a person. What is so important about my life, about me, that is so interesting. They are ready to do so much and to spend so much money. I mean, not spend, waste so much money and break so many laws in order to achieve, to put me in prison. That took so much time. And I think that was part of the coping mechanism, to understand, try to understand everything. Ask questions. Many questions may not have answers, but still you ask questions. And like you said, faith, so I meditate a lot, I pray a lot, and I fast, everything. So, and I'm not cynical. I believe that people are good for the most part, by and large.
Thanks. Did you have anything?
Yeah. I mean, you asked in part about the role of writing.
Yeah.
I think the role of writing and also the role of reading is something that many of the men I met really were drawn to as a way to find ways to cope with this incredible deprivation, typically in solitary confinement. So Jamel in Algeria, when I met with him, showed me pages and pages of lists he made of books that he had read. Many of these men have learned multiple languages during the years that they're in by talking to guards, by reading books in the library. Jamel actually learned English, I believe. He had already was speaking Arabic and French and Berber, but took out Harry Potter from the library and transcribed on the one piece of paper he was allowed per session in French, and then turned the book in and got it in English and wrote it out and did the translation himself, and is now fluent German as well, multiple languages, and having that mental escape of novels and literature is a really time-old coping mechanism for anyone deprived of community. Many of the men that I've met say that they have become much more observant in their Muslim faith as a result of their time, both the meditative practice, the faith, the community, and in lives after Guantanamo that then correlates in differing ways to politicization. So for example, Mozambique in the UK has looked at America's and really the Christian West's denial of personhood to Muslims as a rallying cry, and his life's work now is as an advocate for Muslims and the rights of Muslims, whether they have been imprisoned or simply denied rights. Then when you think about transfer countries and who is going to accept a former prisoner, countries like Hungary with the refugee crisis say, well, we'll take anyone except a Muslim. Or you have places like Slovakia who basically under protest, because they're getting some secret benefit from the United States that we don't fully know about, are willing to take one or two people, maybe 5 or 6, but under incredibly restrictive conditions that really curtail the liberty of the Muslim former prisoners who end up living in these places. So the elements that provide solace, that provide help with coping, then can be complicated in life after.
Yeah, I mean, I can only really add one observation with respect to coping, and that is, that a lot of the men that I know who've been released are not coping well, or having very, very difficult time, and we try to help them with that, but it's devastating. There is, I think, as Debbie said, in my experience working with men who've been released, there is an increased devotion, and that comes out of Guantanamo. Many of Guantanamo is, make no mistake about it, about Islam, right? Only people who are Muslim have been detained there, and that's why they were detained there, right? Not everybody who was brought to Guantanamo was devout, but in my experience, they've become very, very devout. And I'd be interested in Mohamedou's take on this, but my sort of observation in part of why that is the common thread of Guantanamo, right? Guantanamo, the detainee population is very diverse, right? There are people from all over the world. And the issue of language came up, right? There were some people in Guantanamo who were very, very isolated, even from other detainees, by the languages that they spoke, right? The Uyghurs, there were 22 Uyghurs who spoke Uyghur, and nobody else spoke Uyghur or could communicate with them. The guards couldn't communicate with them. Nobody could communicate with them. And they were very, very, the Kazakhs as well, very, very isolated. But the one thing that connected everybody together was their faith. And it became, by my observation, the common thread.
I completely agree with you, Wells. I remember when I arrived in Mike's block in 2000, early 2003. My next cell neighbor was an Afghani young man, about 17 or 18 years old, and he spoke only Pashto, and he was a fee collector in this taxi, collective taxi in Pakistan. And he was just taken, he was grabbed off the street and taken for, I don't know for what, but he didn't speak any language that I spoke, nor did I speak any Pashto. And he spoke Urdu too, but I didn't speak Urdu either. But we conversed for very long nights in a language that I don't remember anymore. But we just, I don't know, we just wanted to communicate. So if you want to communicate with someone, there is always a way to do it. And if you don't want to communicate with them, even if they spoke your mother tongue, you wouldn't be able to do that.
Thank you so much, Mohamedou. I think that's a very moving way to actually close this symposium. Thank you very much for joining us. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you very much to Debi and Wells too, and to everybody who's come. Yeah, thank you. Goodbye.